Hello, as it's the middle of the hottest summer ever, let's perversely explore those iciest of production techniques. The bag of tricks used by Martin Hannett, particularly with Joy Division. Firstly, who was Martin Hannett? He was somebody who kind of fell into production and was in exactly the right place at the right time to indulge his whims. He was a little older than the punk crowd he ended up producing, but that gave him a foundation in other types of music and techniques they hadn't been exposed to. He was heavily into dub and electronic music, along with records dating back to the 50s that made use of artificial reverberation. Doo-wop, rockabilly, crooners, onto psychedelia and krautrock. He had broad taste in music. His second production job was Buzzcocks' classic Spiral Scratch EP. They were the third UK punk band to release a record and the first independent one to do so. His next major job was the first Joy Division album. Doubtless he's best known for his work with Joy Division, but in his capacity as house producer for Factory Records, he did great work with A Certain Ratio, Durruti Column, and my personal favourites, ESG. His own personal favourite production was on magazines The Correct Use of Soap. The hallmarks of his work are the creation of an artificial space which kind of deceives the ear. Rather than faithfully recreating the sound of a band in a room, he went out of his way to create a surreal soundstage. He chose to invent new worlds. In more than one way, Hannett's work with Joy Division is similar to what George Martin did with the Beatles. He led them out of their box, and the music itself lent to his production techniques because of its regimented nature and the fact that there's plenty of space between the instruments. Here are his own words. They were a gift to a producer because they did not have a clue. They didn't argue. The factory sample was the first thing I did with them. I think I'd had a new AMS delay line for about 2 weeks. It was called Digital. It was heaven sent. When little bits of memory started to arrive, those clever guys at AMS stuck them in a box. I'm going to put that in context a minute. It's safe to say that now he would have been spoilt for choice with today's digital audio workstations and their capabilities. At that time, technology hadn't caught up with his flights of fancy. But he was getting there, and he had no small part in its evolution. Here's Tony Wilson, self-styled CEO of Factory Records. Here's what he had to say, quoting Stuart Neve of AMS Systems, who designed the DMX delay. "We used to park in our car, and this lunatic would drive his battered Volvo up from Didsbury onto the same car park, then get out of his car, sit at the back of our car and spend 15 minutes describing the sounds he was hearing in his head. He'd then drive back to Manchester, and we'd drive down to Burnley to create the machine that could create these sounds." So Hannett had creative input on the toys he was using. Not to mention that the Studio Unknown Playters was recorded in Strawberry Studios in Stockport, belonged to 10cc, and they had a lot of sound toys to play with. If you want to hear a very uneven example of the types of sounds that studio could produce, perhaps check out Godley and Cream's great folly of an album, Consequences. It took 18 months to make and was everything bloated and indulgent that punk sought to get rid of. Its massive failure was in no small part due to the arrival of punk in the popular consciousness. The studio that Closer was recorded in, London's Britannia Studios, belonged to Pink Floyd and had many more toys to play with. It also had many huge spaces that could be used as echo chambers. This is what Bernard Sumner says in an autobiography about this. You could send sound through pipe speakers and PA systems all over the building. There was one particular great big room, a snooker room, in which we put a massive PA set up with loads of microphones, and it sounded amazing. There was no real need to use artificial ambience. even if we wanted to. So many of the rooms sounded fantastic naturally. So, having got separation between all the tracks, he placed each one in its own psychoacoustic space, one that could never naturally exist. And as well as echo chambers, he of course used plate reverbs, springs and tape echo, the building blocks of artificial reverberation in the 1970s. Of course, with all the wonders of impulse responses and of course VSTs, this kind of work is a million times easier. You don't have to own a stairwell to put your drums inside one anymore. In the next two parts of this video, I'll go over reproducing some of the techniques and strategies he used. But firstly, let's go over a little of how Joy Division would compose music. I think it could be informative and help how we, as very often individuals, make music. Firstly, they were lucky enough to have a rock-solid drummer in Stephen Morris. He was, as was said about his hero, Jackie Leibzig of Can, the human metronome. Once Morris had come up with a drum riff and a set a tempo for the band, they would jam. This is all covered in depth in John Savage's excellent oral history of Joy Division, by the way. Once tempo and feel had been dictated, bass and guitar would jam. Hook struggled to have his bass heard because of his amp, which led it to him playing higher on the neck just to be heard. The guitar parts are usually minimal, adding atmosphere. Apparently Curtis took the lead on saying what riffs were worth keeping from these jams. It's an efficient way of working. I've counted up how many songs they recorded in just under 3 years, and it's 52. For most of the time, this band were also holding down jobs and often families as well. After the writing process, and often with Curtis's lyrics not yet fully heard over in the rehearsal room din, the band would enter the studio with Hannett, who would first deconstruct their music by isolating the musicians acoustically from each other or just tracking them at different times. This is what Stephen Morris says. The studio was Martin's, and when you were in the studio, you were working for Martin and his whims. In his autobiography, he said this: I would have to record the whole song just playing the bass drum and nothing else, then the snare drum and nothing else, until I built up the part from all the individual pieces. This took considerably longer than the more conventional method of recording and was 10 times more difficult and confusing. Peter Hook in a Record Collector article on Martin Hannett said this: his idea was good things come out of chaos. So chaos is what he caused. He was like a little mischief maker. Okay, so that's the end of part 1 of the video, and so basically explaining what Martin Hannett did and how he produced some of his music. In the next 2 episodes, we're going to talk a little about how Joy Division themselves made their music and talk about some of the techniques that Hannett applied to their music later on.